Let me just say that, I have spoken recently, of course, to our principal allies, to President Obama, to Prime Minister Cameron, to President Hollande. And, our government has been a very reluctant convert to the idea that there needs to be some Western military action regarding the Syrian situation. We have been and remain concerned when we look at this conflict that it is overwhelmingly sectarian in nature and does not have, at the present, any ideal or obvious outcomes. That all said, in talking to our allies, we are convinced that notwithstanding our reluctance, that the risks of the international community not acting in the face of what appears to be an escalation and likely further escalation without action in the use of chemical weapons as a weapon of warfare is an extremely dangerous precedent. This is a very big risk, and we do believe and we do support our allies who are contemplating a forceful action to deal with this. That said, at the present time, the Government of Canada has no plans. We have no plans of our own to have a Canadian military mission. We share the view of our allies that the use of chemical weapons on an unprecedented scale by the Syrian regime constitutes a very troubling development, and if it is not countered, it will constitute a precedent that we think is very dangerous for humanity in the long term. And so obviously we are very supportive of those of our allies who want to take action to try and prevent this development from going further, try and dissuade the Syrian regime from this course of action. At the same time, as you know, we did announce here at the conference further contributions in terms of humanitarian assistance. Canada has, since the beginning, been a strong and generous contributor to humanitarian assistance, both in Syria and in the wider region. And obviously we will continue to make our contribution to that as we go forward on what is a terrible crisis for the people of Syria.
Continue with Alison Crawford from the CBC.
You used the words very troubling development when you talked about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. To a lot of people hearing that kind of language and after seeing the pictures of the dead children, they can't comprehend how world leaders sit and talk and nothing's really happening. And as you say, it presents a precedent no one wants to see. How do you explain that sort of the kind of stalemate that's going on to people who just can't understand why nothing's happening?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really quite simple to explain. There are, broadly speaking, I may be oversimplifying somewhat, but broadly speaking, we have two camps here. Obviously, we share a view with our allies. There is another view, and that view those who speak in favor of this view decry the use of chemical weapons. They will say it is a terrible thing that cannot be tolerated, that something must be done about, but they say at the same time their view is that the absolute authority of the Security Council is necessary for any action, even if that means no action at all will be taken. And we do not share that philosophy. The Security Council, United Nations are very important institutions. Obviously, we would prefer to see global consensus on this, but I think we share, obviously, the view of our allies that when we see developments that we think in the long term are dangerous for the planet and therefore for us as well, we are simply not prepared to accept the idea that there is a Russian veto over all of our actions. And so that's the fundamental difference of opinion here. Let me just be a little clearer on what I said last night about my read of the situation. I don't merely refer to a specific incident being troubling. I think it has been a series of incidents. I believe that what we have been seeing over the past several months is the Syrian government, which finds itself in a stalemate, believes that it can win the war the civil war in Syria through the use of chemical weapons. And they have been step by step ratcheting up that usage to see if anyone is going to challenge it. And I fear that if no one does challenge it, they will use chemical weapons on a scale way beyond anything we have seen to date to win that war. And if that ever happens, I believe, as I told the leaders that last night, that is a precedent that humanity will regret for generations to come.
David Aiken from Sun News.
Hi, Prime Minister. I want to follow up on Syria too, and I wonder if you give us a little more detail on what your interventions were at dinner last night, what you had to say, and perhaps you can comment as well on what Minister Barrett had to say to Minister Lavrov today. We're really keen to sort of see how you were giving it to those guys.
Well, look, you know, we, as I say, I don't try and stand here and purport to speak for other leaders, but we know what the Russian position is, and we know the close relationship that the Russian government has with the Syrian regime. And obviously, for that reason, that's one of the key reasons why we think that ultimately a Russian veto under all circumstances is something that is simply should not be acceptable to ourselves or to our allies. We've been very clear with the Russians and others. I pointed out to leaders last night, not just not just my analysis of the situation, but also I think it's important to point out that our allies, particularly President Obama, are not people who seek military adventure for its own sake. President Obama has worked hard to withdraw the United States from various past military operations. He, like myself, our two governments share deep concerns about some of the elements of the Syrian opposition, recognize that they in and of themselves constitute great threats. And of course, what President Obama and others are proposing is not something they're doing for popularity either. I think he's responding, and all of our allies are responding in a way they think is essential. So, you know, I think, look, our position is clear. We're at a you know, I understand some of us will be putting out a statement later today. We're at an impasse here in terms of what the world community believes should or shouldn't be done. And those who want to act have our full support.
We'll continue with Jacques from Global News, please.
Just wondering, given that stalemate that has emerged here, for those leaders who do want to see some sort of punitive action taken, like yourself, where do you go from here?
Well, look, as you know, that's I think that's ultimately up to those who have the means to undertake punitive action and action for deterrence. President Obama has stated what he would like to do, and he's obviously going to seek approval from the American Congress, so they will, in a sense, have the final word on that. I think the government of France is also determined to act. So it's now in the hands of those who have the means to act. And as I say, they're our friends and allies. I think they're operating with the best of intentions. Obviously, these are difficult calls, but I think they're the right calls under the circumstances.
Jason Fickett from Post Media News, please.
Prime Minister, thanks for your time. Another question on Syria. Obviously, at the G8, you were at the table when Russia and President Putin signed on, basically saying they supported a transitional government. I mean, which leads to believe that another government would come into power. That certainly looks like it was obviously some sort of empty promise. I mean, can you put anything into what Russia says on this file anymore? And I mean, what do you say to him when they signed on to this, for example, the G8, and yet it's appears a completely empty promise that they're not willing to live up to?
Well, as you know, at the G8, we went into the G8, myself and I think some others, extremely skeptical. The Russians agreed to some strong language about transition, where we would go. And in the meantime, what we've seen is the Syrian government step up attempts to win the military conflict through the unprecedented use of chemical weapons. So I think those actions speak for themselves. As some of you know, the Russian government has also tried to allege first, that there may not have been a chemical attack. I don't think anyone believes that. We'll get UN inspectors' report on that pretty soon. But to also allege that this is a conspiracy of the rebels to attack themselves with chemical weapons in order to embarrass the Syrian government. And I don't think that kind of argument, I don't bother refuting it because I don't think it deserves to be taken seriously.
We'll continue with Jennifer Ditchburn from CP. The microphone will come to you.
Prime Minister, in Canada's history, we have had painful experience with chemical weapons, and I wonder whether that has entered into any of your thinking about that. I'm obviously talking about Vimy and other locations.
Yes. Yeah, I grew up only a couple of blocks away from Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto, where men continued to live who had been the victims of chemical weapons attacks in the First World War. Terrible stories. I know they're all passed away now, but I can tell you that was a very real recollection when I was a boy that those kinds of things had happened. But as I pointed out last night, even in the Second World War, even in the war against fascism and Hitler, those forces did not on the battlefield resort to chemical weapons. So I really do believe here that if we're going to sit back and allow a regime to try and win a military conflict through the use of chemical weapons, we are in new territory. We are in brand new territory that is extremely dangerous and that there will be no turning back from. And, as I say, even the most ferocious, despicable and brutal powers for the past 100 years have all stayed away from this kind of warfare. So as I say, I think we're in new territory, and I think it demands a different kind of response from our allies than we would have been prepared to do in other circumstances.
We'll continue with Lori from CBC.
Hi, Prime Minister. I'm just thinking, the way that you've described it here today, you say you're at an impasse, and yet you're also talking about the great concern that this chemical weapons may become, a precedent, the weapon of choice in the future. I tend to like verbs, so I ask, what are you doing? I mean, how far are you willing to go? If it's that dangerous, you're using some pretty strong language here, and yet you're supporting the U.S. morally, you're speaking out against it. But what is Canada willing to do? How far is Canada willing to go?
Well, look, I think the United States and our allies have identified a course of action they could take that they believe will dissuade the Syrian regime from further use of chemical weapons. It's not without risk, but it's also a limited action in terms of scope and duration. It's also the kind of action that, given the nature of the assets would be deployed, that Canada could not contribute and is not being asked to contribute to. So look, all we're doing, not just supporting our allies, but trying to argue vigorously with those on the other side, that when you face these kinds of situations, there are times in politics, it's true in domestic politics, but I think it's true in international politics. There are times in politics where process answers are not good enough. And to simply say, well, there's a UN process, and even if it fails, and fails on the most extreme and dangerous level, we still must follow the process, that's not acceptable. That is not acceptable in our judgment in this circumstance.